The winter had learned her name before any man ever cared to, whispering it through the frozen boards of the cabin she once called home, breathing it into the snowdrifts that swallowed the trail, until all that remained of Eliza Mae Holloway was a woman kneeling on a splintered porch with her hands clasped so tightly they no longer felt like her own. Her breath coming in white, ragged ghosts as the cold pressed closer with every passing second, because they had left her there on purpose, not by accident or mercy or misunderstanding, but with the quiet certainty of people who believed a woman alone in winter was already dead. She had watched their wagon disappear between the trees 2 days earlier, the wheels creaking like a verdict, her sister's shawl still hanging on a nail inside, her husband's boots still by the door, the cabin stripped of food and firewood as cleanly as a picked bone. And in that moment she understood something that hurt worse than hunger. That survival was no longer a shared agreement but a private war, and she was expected to lose. The snow fell with a patience that felt cruel, softening the world until sound itself seemed to freeze, and Eliza pressed her forehead against her knuckles and tried to remember the warmth of other winters, when laughter cracked through the cold and stew bubbled on the stove, when her husband Jonah had still believed men were better than their fears, before sickness took him and neighbors stopped knocking, before whispers grew sharper than knives, before the land decided she was excess weight. Her stomach burned with a hollow ache that had become constant, a gnawing reminder that the body does not care about pride or fairness. And when she stood, her legs trembled so badly she had to grip the cabin wall, splinters biting into her palm, as if the wood itself was trying to hold her back from lying down and letting the snow finish its work. She told herself she would not die kneeling like a beggar, not with her mouth full of prayers no one was listening to. And yet when the wind surged across the clearing and rattled the shutter loose, fear took shape inside her chest, heavy and final, because there was no one coming, no rider on the ridge, no promise hidden in the white horizon. Miles away, beyond the frozen creek and the blackened stumps of a logged-out valley, a man named Caleb Rourke cut into a pine tree with slow, measured swings, each strike of the axe sending a dull echo through his arms, the rhythm the only thing keeping his thoughts from turning back on themselves, because silence had a way of growing teeth when you lived alone. He was a lumberjack by trade and by exile, a man who had drifted west after the war took his brothers and left him with hands that knew how to destroy, but not how to stay. And the mountains suited him because they asked nothing and forgave nothing, a fair bargain in his mind. Snow clung to his beard and the shoulders of his red wool coat, his breath steady, his body aching in a way that felt honest. And when the tree finally gave with a sharp crack and sank into the snow, Caleb rested his forehead against the axe handle and listened to the wood settle, the distant creak of timber and the soft hiss of falling flakes, until something else threaded through the quiet, something thin and wrong, like a sound that did not belong. He straightened, heart tightening, and strained to hear it again. But the forest held its breath, leaving him with the familiar argument in his head, the one that told him loneliness made men imagine things, that survival depended on minding your own business. That help was a luxury people like him had already spent. Still, as he slung his pack over his shoulder and turned back toward his cabin, he noticed tracks half buried by fresh snow, smaller than a man's, leading away from the direction of the old settlement. And though he told himself it was none of his concern, his feet slowed, the weight of the provision sack pulling differently across his back, as if it knew something he did not. Eliza had given up trying to cry because tears froze too fast on her cheeks, leaving her face stiff and burning, and when she forced herself inside the cabin, the cold followed her like a living thing, curling around her ankles, whispering that sleep would be easier, that hunger would quiet if she just lay down. And for a terrifying moment she believed it, sinking onto the floorboards with her back against the wall, staring at the dark beam above her where Jonah had once carved their initials. She spoke to him then, not in anger but in a small, ashamed voice, telling him she was tired, telling him she was sorry she could not be strong enough for both of them. And when her eyes closed, the cabin seemed to tilt, the world narrowing to the sound of her own heartbeat, slow and heavy. It was the creak of a door that dragged her back, a sound so unexpected it felt like a blow, and she jerked upright, fear flooding her veins as the door opened an inch, letting in a slice of gray light and a figure she could not yet make sense of. Broad-shouldered, snow-dusted, motionless as if carved from the storm itself, Caleb stood there with his hand on the latch, the smell of cold and pine filling the room, his gaze dropping to the woman on the floor, her hair braided but loose with frost, her dress worn thin, her eyes too large in a face made sharp by hunger, and something in his chest twisted hard enough to steal his breath, because he had seen death often enough to recognize how close it stood to her now. Neither of them spoke. The silence stretched tight as wire, Eliza's fingers curling into the hem of her skirt as she prepared for whatever cruelty fate had decided to deliver next, and Caleb's mind racing through all the reasons to leave, all the dangers of staying, until he did the one thing he had sworn never to do again. He stepped inside and closed the door behind him, shutting out the storm, unaware that in that single motion he had bound their lives together, because outside the wind rose higher, and the mountain prepared to test whether Mercy could survive the winter at all. The fire took a long time to wake, like it resented being called back into a world this cold, and Eliza watched the flames tremble as Caleb fed them the last of his dry kindling, the light carving his face into something rough and uncertain, a stranger shaped by solitude and hard choices, while the warmth crept into her fingers with a pain so sharp it made her gasp, reminding her how close she had come to losing the simple right to feel. Caleb said little, only what was necessary, his voice low and steady as he poured broth from his provisions sack into a tin cup and held it to her lips, not asking permission because hunger had already stripped away such formalities, and as she drank, tears finally came. Not from weakness, but from the shock of being seen again, of mattering when the world had quietly decided she did not. He listened as she spoke in fragments, about the sickness, the wagon, the neighbors who smiled as they took what they needed and left her with promises that froze harder than the ground, and each word settled into him like a weight, stirring memories he kept buried of men walking away from suffering because it was easier than carrying it. When the storm worsened that night and the cabin groaned under the pressure of wind and snow, Caleb made a decision that felt heavier than any log he had ever hauled, lifting Eliza into his arms and carrying her through the dark to his own cabin, deeper in the timberline, every step a gamble against the cold and against the fear that he might be too late, his breath burning, his muscles screaming, but something fiercer than survival driving him forward, something that sounded dangerously like a bear. Days passed in a blur of smoke and fever, of Eliza drifting between sleep and waking, while Caleb chopped wood until his hands split, hunted when the storm eased, and sat by her side when the night grew too quiet, speaking to her even when she could not answer, because the silence reminded him too much of graves. Slowly, stubbornly, she returned, color finding its way back into her cheeks, strength into her limbs, and when she finally stood on her own by the window and watched the snow fall without fear, she understood that being saved did not erase what had been taken, but it gave her the chance to decide what came next. Spring arrived late that year, clawing its way through the ice, and with it came the men who had abandoned her, riding up the valley with practiced regret and hollow apologies, offering help now that survival no longer cost them anything. And Eliza stood beside Caleb on the porch of his cabin, her spine straight, her voice calm and unshaking as she told them she owed them nothing. That winter had already judged their character and found it wanting. When they left, smaller than they had arrived, Caleb expected the familiar ache of endings, the instinct to retreat back into loneliness before it could be taken from him. But Eliza surprised him by staying, by learning the rhythms of the land, by turning survival into something shared, something chosen. Together they built a life that did not erase the past but honored it, a life forged not by convenience, but by a moment when one man stepped into the cold instead of turning away, and one woman refused to let the world decide her worth. And as the years carried their story forward like a quiet legend through the mountains, it stood as a reminder that even in the harshest winters, mercy can change fate, that one choice can echo louder than cruelty, and that stories like this live on only when they are remembered. So if this tale of survival, destiny, and second chances moved you, if you believe stories still matter, stand with us by subscribing to the Western Tales, where forgotten lives and untold truths of the frontier are brought back into the firelight. One story at a time.